So for the basics of topology, we'll get down to the core of the most basic elements of what we can do with topology. So the first thing you see is I've got this object selected, and it's actually in what is called object mode. So if we have just an object selected and we're working at the object level, we can put it on the move, rotate, or scale tool. And you can see that we've got these controls here to move up and down in a specific axis right here. And if you take a look at here, we can move in the Z-axis, the Y-axis, or the X-axis. Or we can move in two axes using these planes that you see here. So we can push and pull this along these two different planes. I can move it up in Y, and I'm moving it along Z with this one here. Now with this one, I can move it along the X and the Z. And on this one, I can move it along X, and I can move it along Y for that as well. We've already looked at previous videos where you can take a look at the object mode. You can move things numerically. So if I wanted to put it over a specific amount of units, I can type those new units directly into the channel box like this, and I can do the same thing with rotation like this, and we can also do this with scale as well. So I'll go ahead and set these back and zero these out like this. And accidentally got one of the scales here. So let me do one there. Okay, so that's that for this one for rotation. I guess something else that we could talk about is this, that if we double click on the tool settings, we can move this in world space. I'm just going to go ahead and reset the tool like this. And what I was moving was in world space before. So you can see if you take a look at the grid, and we've got the grid on, it's basically moving it along this world axis that you see. Now if I rotate my object like this, we can rotate it something like this here. Okay, and I'm going to put it back on the move tool. And if you see the move manipulator, it's set to world. So I can move this still in X, Y, and Z. But if I turn this on to object mode, you can see how the manipulator changes. It has an understanding of the orientation of the object itself. So that's what it means for us to move this thing in object mode. So that's going to be pretty handy if we want to rotate this thing to a specific degree, and then we want to push this thing in its own object space and move that around. Okay. So the other thing, I guess, is this affects things like symmetry if we're going to turn symmetry on. So if I open up symmetry settings, and we've got symmetry turned on right now and it's set to world, if I go to try to move this other vert that's over here, it's not going to be able to do it because the object is rotated, and in the world it's going to look for a vertice that's exactly on the opposite side of the world for this, so it can't find it. But if we turn the symmetry on to object, like object X, you can see that the symmetry is now found because it has an understanding of the rotation of the object in object space, and then we're able to kind of move those verts. Okay, I'm just going to turn symmetry off. I'm going to take this and we're going to move this back. I'm going to rotate everything to 0, and I'll put the translation back to 0, and we're back to where we were at before. Okay, so there is an object space and world space movement for the translation, for the rotation, and for the scale as well. So just kind of keep that in mind. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is we're in object mode right now, and if we go to component mode, that means we're diving down into the actual object itself, and we're going to start moving components or smaller vessels of that larger kind of whole piece that you see there. And those things are called vertices, edges, and faces. And so we'll take a look at each one of those. Just a note for the interface, while you're working in object mode, you can see the hotkey for this, for switching out of object mode into component mode, is hitting F8. So if we hit F8, we can go from object mode to component mode. We can also right click on the object and say object mode, and then right click, and if we go into the vertices or the faces or the edges, that is switching us back and forth between this object mode and component mode. Now on the interface at the current time, you can hide or show these finer levels of what you're going to pick on here. So if I go into component mode, you can see that we've got, if we hover our cursor over this, this is verts. If we do that, then we can select edges, and then we've got faces like this. So we'll select this. If I right click on here and say edge and select that. You can see we're in edge mode. If we right click on here and we say face, we're selecting faces. So you can turn off everything and then only turn on a specific one. So that's like selection masking. So you can make sure if the only thing you want to work with is verts, you can turn everything off and just work with verts alone. You usually don't really use that too often unless it's a very specific case where you want to make sure you're just working with that one particular type. Sometimes maybe if you've got a skeleton on your model and you're having trouble selecting and stuff like that, you might want to use something like that. Okay, so let's right click on here. Let's go to vertices. Let's talk about vertices. So this is like the smallest increment that we can move on the model itself. So we can really tweak out the shape and we can get all the same controls for manipulators. We can use these planes on here just like we're used to with the object mode. But you can see we can kind of tweak this thing like this in here. And I'm going to hit undo real quick. And I'm going to turn on symmetry. We're going to do symmetry and I'll just do, we can keep it an object because everything's good right now. But we can see that we can kind of tweak the shape, and if we want to keep everything symmetrical, this is a nice tool. And if we hold down X, we can temporarily turn on grid snapping. Now you could turn grid snapping on and leave it on constantly, but I like to use the hotkey for that. And so we could snap with this right in through here. And so we're able to manipulate the shape that way. So we can move one vert individually at one time. If you select multiple vertices, you can move those both at the same time. So if I hold down X, I can push this back in the grid like this and start to make an interesting shape that way. If I want to bring this up to the grid up here, I can hold down X and then drag along this here, and it's going to snap. It's going to be like basically this same grid but turned here, so it's invisible. You've got to kind of just imagine that those steps are happening, but you can see it kind of snap up to the grid like this at this point. So I can take this as well, and then I can hold down X and then move up. The other thing to kind of note about this is if we go back to object mode out of component mode, we are moving the vertices. That doesn't change anything about the object's location. So you can see the pivot point for the object is still set in the world origin here. And as we move vertices around, so if I hit F9 or we right click on here and say vertice and I raise the entire object up, the pivot point for the object is going to still stay. So we can hit F8 to go back into object mode, and you can see that our pivot point stays exactly where it's at. We've looked at an earlier video. If you tap D, you can move the pivot point around and you can re-snap it and things like that. But that does not, moving these components does not change anything about the object space or the object orientation. Now that can become a little bit confusing if you go to rotate the object. If I selected all these verts and I moved it, it looks like we've rotated the object, but everything with the orientation of this is still the same. So just kind of keep that in mind whenever you're working with this like this. Okay, so that's vertices. Again, that's going to be the lowest and smallest increment. You can either work with individual ones or you can work with symmetry turned on. Let's take a look now at working with edges. So we can right click and say edge, and if we want, the hotkey for that is F10. Verts was F9, and then F10 will give you edges like this. And so edges is basically like working with two vertices at the same time. So you can take this edge, you can move it like this, and we can still snap and do everything that we just did with vertices. We can rotate these, and you can see how that kind of works like this, and then we can move, and you can also scale as well. So if we scale edges, again, it's basically like having these two verts together and scaling them. But we could work with multiple edges all at the same time and scale those up, and then we could also move multiple edges all at one time. You can see the front of this moves too, because again, imagine this edge. If you think about what it's doing, it's got a vert that's at the end of this, and it's kind of manipulating the vertice here, 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 and here. Everything that it touches, it's manipulating like that. Okay? And so I think that's probably going to make some sense for you. You got to move these things around a little bit, kind of get used to it. And then the next level that we're going to go to is if we right click over this and say face, we can move a face. Now moving a face is basically whatever this face touches, it's touching these edges and these verts. So it's like it's moving this entire mass all at one time. So it's going from the smaller to like medium, and I would say edges, you could think of them as medium, and then faces is like large forms that you're moving around. And then the largest form of all is the object mode that we would work in for that. So again, you can take the whole face and you can manipulate it using these the different scale tools that we've got in here. So we can scale it in this dimension, and you just saw what happened whenever we scaled it that way. So something that's kind of interesting, I'm going to rotate it here. If we scale, you can see we can scale this way and it'll get really long, but if we scale here, it'll kind of hit a limit because everything kind of lines up, and then it's basically you've flattened out that face so it has nowhere else to kind of go. And if you take a flat face and you try to scale it out this direction, can't really go anywhere, right? Because it's completely flat at that point. And you would have to do something like what I showed you, where you take this and you would rotate this a little bit. So I'm going to go to F9 and I'll go to Verts, or you can right click and say Vertice, and then just move this thing down like this. I'll go ahead and move this up here. I'll take the bottom base of this, hold down X and move that up on the grid. We've got this, hold down X and move this on the grid as well. Something else to kind of note about this, I think this could probably be the last thing that we kind of talk about on here. So if I grab all these vertices and if I hold down X, and if I'm moving in world, I can hold down X and move on a specific axis, and it's going to move that whole group together and snap to the grid. Basically because there's a setting turned on that's called retain component spacing. So if we go to move and snap settings, let's take a look at this. This keeps this entire selection together as if it's kind of a group, and it moves and it snaps and everything else like that as a group. Okay, so that could come in handy at times whenever you need to move things specifically. Now if we want to snap this to the grid, we have the same controls with vertices as we do with the object. So the components have the same ability to move their pivot point like we do in the object. So if we tap D, we can move the pivot point on this. Now, I showed you if we held down X, we can temporarily turn on snap to grid. Now, if we hold down V, we can turn on snap to points temporarily. So if I hold this down, I can move this in one axis here and then hit this vertice and it'll snap to that. I can move it back here and it'll snap to here. Now it's not moving up and snapping because I'm just using this one axis like this. So if I want to snap up here, I'll hold down V and I'll snap up to this. If I drag it down, it'll snap to here. So I'm going to snap right to here like this, and we can hold down X and temporarily turn on grid snap, and we can snap to the grid as well. So now that I've moved the pivot point of this to the front of this edge that we see here, these vertices, and it's snapped up this way, now I can hold down X and I can snap to the grid. Sorry, let me hold down V and snap here. I forgot to tap D to go back out of that mode. Okay, so now we're in the mode of moving because we just tap D to move in and out of moving the pivot or moving the actual objects. So hold down X and I'll click and I'll snap to this here like this, and I'll hold down X and I'll snap, and you can see how now we're snapped completely to the grid here, and these are moving along together as a mass. So now that we're snapped up to the grid, we can hold down X and then move this, and you can see we're moving the whole group and the whole mass of these things together, and we're snapping to the grid the entire time. Okay, so that comes in handy at times. That is the default setting. It's actually not the setting that I use most of the time. Most of the time I want this behavior. If we take this off and if we hold down X to snap to the grid, if we move this forward, you can see everything moves forward and snaps to that as well. Now, I don't really want to do this. If I hold down X and if I move up, you can see it snaps everything to that flat plane moving up that way. Usually what I do is I use this to kind of flatten out things. So it's possible if I wanted to flatten this out, right here I can grab all these vertices, hold down X, and then snap this way. It's very similar to, I'm going to hit undo, to what we looked at. If we take all these verts and we put it on the scale tool, if we move it all the way here like this, it's flattening it out. Now we would have to move these, hold down X, and then we could snap to there. So it's kind of similar to what we were doing with that translate or the scale tool, but we're ensuring with what we're doing that way that we're actually moving the entire selection that we have. Like, so we've got all these verts, and I'm going to hold down X, and I'm going to snap to the grid this way. And so you can see now everything's nice and snapped up. Everything's going to be precise whenever we want to manipulate this. Now I think from the side view I've got to go, and you can see there's an angle on this, so I'd have to hold down X and kind of snap this way. What this allows us to do is we can go into object mode like this. So I hit F8, or you can right click and say object mode. Now that we know that everything snaps to the grid, if we hit Control D, that's going to go edit, and it's going to be duplicate for us. So we can duplicate our object, and I'm going to hold down X, and I'm going to move back this way like that. And I did miss these two verts. These are not exactly snapped to the grid. So let's do that. Let's take these verts, F9, select this, I'm going to hold down X, and I'm going to snap to the grid like this at this point, and I think we should be good. So let's do that again. We're going to duplicate. The hotkey for that is Control D, and we can hold down X, and I can move this back, and you can see that if I do that, if I've done this correctly, which I still missed a small point on here, let's just take this to make sure we can get this on the grid. I'm going to move this, and I think we have to maybe move that. There we go. Everything's snapped up. So this is a good test for this to make sure everything's actually snapped to the grid. So we can hit Control D. I'm going to hold down X, and I'm going to move. So I'm trying to make basically kind of like a modular part that can be duplicated and moved like this. I'm going to hit Control D again, hold down X, and you can see how we can keep building off of this and extending out. We've got these different objects that we've got at that point. And then we can move these. I do think that this is kind of a cool feature that if you hold down Shift now while you drag out, it drags out a copy. So you can drag out copies that way. And if I hold down Shift and drag out, and if I hold down X while I do that, I can drag out a copy, and it will be snapping to the grid for us. Okay. So the other thing that we can do with this that I think is pretty interesting, select the object, and if you hold down Shift, and I'm going to hold down X to drag out that copy like that, if we hit Shift D after we've duplicated and moved and translated the object, we can keep duplicating with that same amount of movement and translation on there. So I'm going to select this and get rid of that right there, like that. So you could tell with that one, just moving it along. We could also do, I'm going to hit Control D, and I'm going to move it, and I'm going to rotate it a little bit like this, and I'm going to scale it down just slightly. And now it's going to, if I hit Shift D, it's going to keep doing that for me. So it's going to keep moving, and it's going to keep translating, and it's going to keep scaling all at the same time. So you can do some pretty cool and interesting things like this. So I wasn't going to get into this, but as we move away from the camera, this is a really annoying problem with Maya, that it starts to draw these really black kind of gunk things. And if it's too far away from the camera, it just starts to clip it out like that. If we select our camera, let's hit Control A to bring up the attribute editor. That's because of this near clip plane or the far clip plane. So as it disappears, there's a clipping plane for where the camera draws out. And if you want to extend that, I just put like another 0 in this thing, and it can push out even further. If you want to have it go really far, you can maybe add 2 zeros to that. And then this black junk that's kind of drawing on here is the near clip plane. So I might put that at 1. Maybe depending on the size of these objects, I'm working on a fairly decent scale, so you might have to go even larger with that. So you can see if I do 10, it fixes that problem. So I usually start with 1, and if I'm really looking at the object far away and it's really having problems with that, then I'll put the near clip plane to 10. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good amount for you to take a look at for right now for working with the object and component mode, and then also how to duplicate your objects and then duplicate with transforms as well. So go ahead and play around with that and get used to that, and then that's going to let you take these basic shapes that you're using and manipulate them to a very high degree. The next thing I'd like to talk to you about is the smooth mesh preview or subdivision surfaces in Maya. So if I tap 1, this is our base object, and we're just starting with a basic cube again. And if we tap 3, we can view this model in the smooth mesh preview mode. So that feels probably kind of odd that it's taking a cube and turning it into a sphere. You can see as I've got this selected, you can see kind of the underlying base geometry or the base cage of this. And it still has, if you see the edges and the verts, and you can think of these as a face, it still has all those elements. But really what's going on behind the scenes here, if we open up the attribute editor and hit Control A, there's a smooth mesh preview area. And whenever we tap 3, we are taking a look at that. We're turning this on here, right? So if I tap 1, it's back in the object mode that we see. If I tap 3, we're turning this thing on here, and we're taking a look at it in the smooth mesh preview mode. So right now we've got a divisions of 2, and let's put this to 1. And I can turn on this display subdivision so you can kind of see behind the scenes what's really going on here. So if we go back to display level 0, and that's like kind of programming terms. In programming terms, they start with the number 0. So this is the base, and then one division up from this, they're going to take each one of these faces. It's going to be divided into 4, and it does a smoothing kind of algorithm between this surface and this surface. So if you think of this as this is a 90-degree plane, as it starts to round out, we're going to get some curvature going this direction. We're going to get some curvature going this direction too. So we'll put it up one division level, and you can see this is the curvature that is starting to happen. It does some type of averaging, mathematical averaging between this surface and this surface here. And so at this level, this is the first subdivision level up. It's taken each face and divided into 4, and it's smoothed based upon the other faces around it. So the next level up, we're going to go to 2, and it's going to take each one of these faces, divide it 4. It's going to take this face, divide it 4, and so on across the entire object, and do another smoothing algorithm on it. So you can see as we go up to this level, we're starting to get finer level of polygons on there. If we jump up to the next level, it's going to take each one of these faces and divide it into 4 and keep doing what it's been doing. But you can see it's starting to get more and more resolution across the object. So as we get along the outer edge of this thing, you can see we still have a little bit of faceting, or you can kind of see the polygons on there. If we go up to 4, you can see what we've got going on there with that. So we're able to kind of quickly turn that cube into a sphere, and we can raise up the number of preview subdivisions like this. And yeah, so one thing to note about this turning a cube into a sphere, it's not a perfect sphere. So if we were to go and say create polygon primitives and do a sphere, and so let me take a look at the options that have gone on there. I think that's pretty good. And if we scale this thing up, you can see that this thing is not a perfect sphere like this. So if I tap 4 for the wireframe for this, now it is possible that we can transfer the information from this sphere to this one, so we can make it into a perfect one. So if I'm going to bump up the resolution of that polysphere that you see there, like that. And the other thing that we would need to do is, I'm going to hide this sphere real quick. We would need to take our object and convert it over to actual geometry. Right now, it's still just this cube. We tap 1, then we tap 3 for the smooth mesh preview. It's just in a preview mode, so the geometry doesn't actually exist at this higher level to actually manipulate it. So there's no way to like kind of get to the vertices of this and manipulate it. What is interesting is if we right click in here and say vertice, we can manipulate the base cage. So it's probably going to look kind of weird where we can select this vertice and it's way over here, but really if we tap 1, you can see it's removing this base cage. So I can click and I can kind of drag this out, and I can manipulate it like that. If we hit F10, we can still manipulate our edges that we see. And if we hit right click and say face, we can select the face, and we can manipulate the face on here and then do rotation and everything else like that for this. So I'm going to hit undo to get back to where we have our sphere. So I just wanted to let you know that that geometry does not really exist in that mode. So what we need to do, if we want to convert this over to actual geometry, we select it, and then we go to modify and say convert, and then we say convert smooth mesh preview to polygons. And so after we do that, it puts a new node over here into the channel box, and it's basically whatever that division level that we were at, that we were taking a look at, it actually converts that over to real geometry. It puts this new node on there, and we could always get back to the base cage by tapping 0 on there for division. So let's put 0, and if we go hit 1, so we still have all those controls on there, but it's still live, right? So if I tap 4 on this and hit enter, and I'll hit 5 to see this. If we don't want any of that information in there anymore, and we want to kind of freeze the model, we have to delete the history. So the hotkey for that is Alt-Shift-D, and you should get used to that. You can see you can come up here, edit, and then delete by type in history. So you can see the hotkey there. So there's 2 different places you can get to it. I think you're going to need this quite a bit, so you should learn that hotkey, Alt-Shift-D. So we'll delete by type history, and now that model is frozen. Let's bring back our sphere. So I'm going to select it, hit Shift H, and if you remember about show and hide, we can go to display, and we've got hide and show, and you can see the hotkeys for these things here too. So get used to those. You're going to use that a lot as well. So I'm going to select this object first, the cube that we turned into the sphere, and then I'm going to hold down Control and select it in the outliner, and we got this one here. And then we're going to go to mesh, and then we're going to use this transfer attributes and use the option box for this. So we're going to transfer the vertex positions of the one model to the other. I'm going to turn everything else off, and I'm going to sample in world space. So basically when we do this, it should take our new polycube that we turned into a sphere, and it should take all the vertices and basically like snap it to the sphere or shrink wrap it. So I actually got the order incorrect for that. So let's do this order like that. So you see I had to select the sphere first and then the cube. Sometimes I get a little confused as to what the selection order is, and if it doesn't go that way, just reverse it. So I'll hit apply like that, and you can see now that it's taken our cube and it's snapped it to that sphere, and so now we have a perfect sphere. I'm going to hit delete history, Alt-Shift-D, and then that'll allow me to move this thing. And I just wanted to show you visually the difference between this and the geometry type and why you might want to do this. So this is not a bad type, but you get these what they consider poles. So all the geometry has to kind of flow into this one particular spot here, like this, and this can cause pinching on your surface sometimes. So it's makes a surface that's just not completely perfect. So if you wanted to do a round surface like this, now yeah, you can see how the geometry is just different between these two things here. This is also, I like to kind of use this. I'm going to delete that one, and I'll put this back to 0 here. So anytime you need to create a geometry flow for like a head or something like that, this is a really good setup to kind of look at. I'm going to select the verts in through here. I'm going to turn on symmetry. So let's select through this kind of like this, and I know I got a rough selection. Let me make sure I'm looking at it correctly here. So we've got that, and I'm going to turn on this soft mod fall off that you see here. So I'm going to tap B, and that'll give us this fall off that we see here. If we double click on our move settings, we can go to soft selection. You can see that when we turn B, that's turning that on. And we've got this fall off mode, it's called volume. We got a fall off radius. So you can do this with a slider, or you can hold down B and then click and drag left or right. Now sometimes whenever we first do this fall off radius is like so huge that it takes a really long time to hold down B and click and drag it down. So sometimes I might have to just open this up and take the slider and then drag it down. But once you do that, if you hold down B, you can click and drag that like this. So what I wanted to show you through that, not only we're going to take a look at the soft mod tool, which is kind of cool, and it lets you kind of move this around like virtual clay at that point, but we're able to take a shape like this and kind of manipulate it, and we're starting to build something that kind of feels like a head. So I'm going to pull that in for a face here, and what I wanted to point out about that is just take a look at the way that the geometry flows from this thing. So we can take this and kind of move this back. I'm just going to select the big chunk and move for the back of the head. So you can see that the way that this works, I'm going to tap B to turn this off, so we can, if you think about this edge here, and then this edge, and then this edge, still being the cube that we had. We've got the top to the head, and we've got a side, and we've got a back. And so this is a good way to think about how do you turn the geometry or make the geometry flow on a surface like this that is getting to be a bit more complex. And if you took something like, I'll right click and say face. And let's just select this. And if we did something like extrude that out and move that out, that could start to be something like an ear. So let me just do this real quick. Select this here, and then we'll tap 3 for it. And I don't like the display of this thing, so I'm going to come here and I say use the... Yeah, I don't want to display the subdivision, so I'm just going to turn that off, and you can see what we've got here. But that could be the beginning of what you would consider like a head or something like that. I think the level's a little bit too high for it. But again, it's just a way to kind of think about how to, whenever you get a little bit more complex with your geometry, this geometry flow that you might see within here. Okay, so I'm going to delete that real quick. I'm going to just make a cube again, and then this time I'm going to manipulate this thing. I'm going to take the edge, pull it down this way, and then we're going to tap 3 for this. And then I wanted to show you this. This preview subdivision levels, if you hit page up or page down, that's the hotkeys for manipulating this thing from a very easy hotkey kind of way, right? So if we hit page up, we're making this thing a whole lot smoother like this. And if I take the tool for slicing through this object, if we go to the modeling toolkit, we can hit Control-Shift-X. That's the hotkey for invoking the multi-cut tool. But they got a really nice tool in here. If you hold down Control, you can insert edge loops through this. Now this probably looks a little confusing for you at the very beginning because we're working in this new subdivision smooth mesh preview kind of mode. If we tap 1, you can always get back to your base cage, and it probably makes a little more sense what's going on at that point. So check this out. If we want to make this edge a little bit harder in through here, so it's got nice soft rounding, if we get this really close to this edge like this, and I hold down Control and then click, we've built what is called like a holding edge on our support edge. And if we tap 3, you can see what's going on here. It starts to kind of harden up this edge. Now if I do this on the corners, watch this. If we hold down Control and click here, and I want to hold this edge, and I think I got some bad geometry through here, so let's just click here like this. I'll tap 3, take a look at that. So I hate to have to kind of bring this up at an early stage with Maya, but sometimes whenever we're using this tool with symmetry, it just has problems. So you can see asymmetry, I can turn that off. Maybe if I put on World X, let's try that and see if it does. Nope, still got some problems. So symmetry, I'll turn it off. And then I can hold this edge here like I was wanting to kind of show you this. And then the tool works as expected. Real sorry that's happening, but it's some kind of bug. It just should not be happening. So I'm going to tap 3 for this, and you can see everything on this side is able to build this up. And then what I wanted to show you from that is if we do these holding edges like this, we get this kind of nice hard edge. We're actually going to talk about this a little bit later with geometry, so I'm kind of jumping ahead just a little bit too much. But one thing, if you run into this problem where it's not behaving so well with the multi-cut tool, what I like to do with that is maybe build one half of the side and then go to mesh mirror, and then I can always tell it to use these settings. I'm going to cut the geometry and I'm going to mirror it across the world axis this way. So I want everything geometry wise on this side to be on this side. So I got a mirror direction of negative right here. So I'm pulling mirror x axis, and we can take a look here. So it's going to mirror from this side over, because this is positive. This is positive for Y, this is positive for Z, and this is positive for X. So if I want to do the opposite side, that needs to be negative. And I can tell it to combine with the original, and I usually put a setting of this custom threshold of 0.001, which is really, really small, so it has to mean that vertices sit directly on top of each other in order to merge. So I can hit apply like that, and then now we've got our object and it's pushed over. So I'll tap 3 for that, and you can see we've got this object, and we're taking a look at the smooth mesh preview version, and we've got this really nice clean topology like that. But we still have very few vertices to kind of work with. So if we want to grab these verts, and I'll tap 3, we can still manipulate the surface like this, and I can click and kind of drag this up, and you can see we get really clean geometry, but it's very few points to kind of have to work with on this, and we can get a really nice clean look. And so if I want to grab these and kind of pull this in, we can do that. I did have symmetry turned off, so if I want to get symmetry back, I can always mirror it across like that. And so that's a way that we can work with as few points as possible, but that we can get this really super clean geometry that we're looking at. Okay, so I know that's probably a little bit too much just for this section, because a little bit later we're going to talk about these different geometry types and how we can build this, but this is a way that we can work with subdivision surfaces, and we're working with the smooth mesh preview, and we're able to use a lower amount of geometry to build more complex surfaces. Okay, now that we know a little bit about subdivision surfaces and smooth mesh preview inside of Maya, let's look at some additional, more advanced ways of holding edges or creating geometry inside of Maya. So what we've got here is 3 different methods of things. We've got bevel, fencing, and creasing. And before I get moving a little bit too much, I wanted to point out that there is an artist called Mussi, and he's got a video that goes into a lot of depth about this, and I've been able to learn a lot from this artist. Wanted to point his YouTube channel out to you, and he's got a lot of different videos that cover different techniques on modeling and stuff like that. So a lot of great content, and just wanted to point that out to you. So some of the things that are kind of talked about in there is that we've got these different methods of holding our edges on here. So the first one is bevel, and then this one is considered like fencing, and then this one is creasing. So the first one, I think it's going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to create a cube like this, just raise it up so we can take a look at it here. And if we right click and go to our edges, we can select edges like this, and then we're going to use the beveling tool. So if we go to edit mesh and then bevel and then do the option box, you can see the hotkey for that is Control B, and we can get to it that way, and we can do the option box for it. That's one way of getting to it. The other way is if you've got your edges selected, you can shift right click and then get to this marking menu and do a bevel edge, and then let's get to the option box for this as well. And so these are some of the options that I like to use for this. If we do a chamfer, we'll talk about this in just a second here. We'll go ahead and hit apply, and you can see we've got some beveling here. And with the fraction on here, we can middle mouse drag like this, and that's going to be changing the values pretty quickly on this. So if we click and drag on this, and if we hold down control while we do this, we get finer levels of control as we do this. So that's probably going to be a little bit better for what we're looking for. I'll do it a fraction of 1 here. And then segments, if we click and drag that, we can push this here. Now what I want you to see is there's certain numbers for this, for the segments, that will allow us to continue to take this face that's generated here, and I want it split in half. That way we can always keep a top, front, back, left, right, top. So if we do a segments of 2, you can see that gives us a split right down the middle. Now if we do 3, it's not going to, but if we go up to 4, it's going to add enough geometry where we still have these splits that we can split this off like this for these different faces on there. If you ever need to get back to this, we can go to the channel box. You can select the bevel, and you should be able to see it within there. You might be able to select an edge, and you can select this object here, or this little icon here, and get back to that. But let's just go ahead and select that to get this these options back within through here. So again, if we do 5, we don't have enough. If we do 6, we've got enough of a split that is creating even geometry on there. So that's going to be kind of like hard baked into the model and give us this nice kind of rounding. Now if we take this chamfer and we have it on, it does rounding along through here, like what we see here. But if we middle mouse drag that off, you can see it adds the divisions to it, but it doesn't do any of the rounding. So we'll leave that on for this here. So that's the bevel method. Okay, and let's just go ahead and push this off to the side here. I'm going to do another cube, and I'm going to push this up right here like this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the modeling toolkit, and I'm going to use the multi-cut tool, and I'm going to add a division here, here, and here like this, and also here. Okay, now that's not going to be symmetrical. If you want it to be symmetrical, we just looked in the last video how we can go to mesh, and we can mirror this across the x-axis for this, like that. And then now we've got symmetrical geometry. And what I want to do with this, I'm going to take this face and I'm going to extrude it down. Before I do this, I'm going to select these two faces, and I hit F11 for that. Remember, we can always right click on here and we can get to vertices, edges, and faces. So however you want to do it. I'm going to delete these out, and I'm going to take these two faces that you see here, and I'm going to shift right click, and I can say extrude face like this. Okay, and I'm going to push this down, and I'm going to hold down V, and I can snap right to here. Now that we've got these extra faces here that stayed, and I don't need these anymore, I'm going to select this one and delete it. And then if we tap 3 for the smooth mesh preview, you can see what we're getting. We're getting like this like chair kind of thing. Now I need to merge the vertices on here. If you tap smooth mesh preview for this, this is a good way to kind of see like something's just not right with this. I'll tap 1 for this, and we'll right click on here and say vertice. Now we could select the vertices here like this, these two verts. We could shift right click and say merge vertices, and we could say merge vertices to center, and that would merge those two. And if I grab these, I can tap G for my last command, and I'll tap 3, and you can see how we're starting to merge those verts together. It's still creating this crease edge right here because these are not merged together. Now while you're in the smooth mesh preview version, you can select the verts this way too, and you can see I can tap G for my last command, and you can see how that's starting to merge these things together like that. The other way is I'm going to hit undo and bring everything back to where these are not merged at all. I could tap 1, go here like this, select all the verts in the mesh, and if I shift right click and go to the merge vertices, we can do a merge vertices with the option box. And if we put a really low threshold on here, I take off this always merge for 2 vertices, do a really low threshold and do 0.001 like this, and that means basically with this threshold these verts have to be pretty much snapped together in order to merge. But you saw how I moved and I snapped everything, so I know that it's snapping. This is really cool because it lets me be a little bit more sloppy with my selection. I can just select everything, and then with this threshold I can merge the verts all together all in one shot like that. And now if I tap 3, you can see how everything is now merged together. So I'm going to tap 1, I'm going to delete history on this. Because I'm going to do this bevel, fencing, and creasing just like we did with these cubes here, I'm going to duplicate this 3 different times. So I'm just going to move this back like this, duplicate it, Control D, and leave it here like this. Okay. So one thing that we can do is if we come here like this, we can select the edges. So we can select the edges that we want to bevel one at a time. If we double click, we can get an edge loop going across like here. So this is a lot of work to kind of maybe select exactly what we're looking for. So you can see how we can do this. It's going to take a little bit of time, and hopefully you can see what I'm trying to select. I'm just trying to select these outer edges like this and get this all selected up. And I'm moving around the object, holding down shift and double clicking, and it's adding to the selection and getting some edge loops on here. So I've got everything selected like this. Now we can shift right click and do our bevel edge. I think it said Control B was also in a way that we could bevel this thing, and that's going to bring this up. And then we can do the fraction. I actually like the distance on this, and we'll do the segments, and we'll do 4. Let's take a look if that number will give us what we're looking for. Yeah, I still have a split here, and we got this extra geometry here like that. So this works. I'm going to hit undo real quick, and I want to show you another method of being able to select this pretty quickly, and we'll have to kind of talk about our normals. And so you can see we've got hard edges on here. Let me turn off the wireframe on shaded, and you can see we've got hard edges on here for everything. If I select F10 or right click on here and say edge and select all the model, we can shift right click and we can go to soften harden edges. I'll just soften everything, and the shading looks pretty horrible on this, and that's because we've made soft smoothing angles between all of our edges that you see here. So it tries to shade between this face and this face. All the faces are now starting to try to shade across there. So it produces this kind of look, and sometimes you're going to want that. Now if we select all of our edges and we turn everything and we shift right click and say soften harden edges and we do everything hard edge, it works, but we're actually even doing hard edges between like this edge, this edge, this edge here. It probably doesn't really make too much of a difference on here unless we take like something like this and we kind of move it out. And now you can see it's going to be having like hard edges on everything. If I select just this edge, we can just work one edge at a time, and I shift right click and I say soften edge. You can see now we're starting to get some smoothing across there, and if I wouldn't want hard edges on these edges here, I can select it and I can say shift right click and I'll soften the edge here, and you can see how we're starting to build some nice shading across here, but you can kind of still see it's still hard in through here. So if we select this edge and this edge, shift right click and say soften edge like this, it'll shade smoothly across this entire face. So maybe that's what we want. I'm going to hit undo to get us back to where we have our object just like that. Okay, now we could select all the edges in the object and say shift right click and say soften edge, and then we can do a soften harden and do the option box for this, and then we can tell it to do an angle of 30 degrees on here. So I'll hit apply for this, and it probably just not going to look like anything kind of changes. It holds all these hard edges, but if we did this thing, the history should still be on here for this poly soft edge right here like that. And if we take this face and we move it out, you can see that it's going to hold that softened edge like that. Now if we go and pull it out something that's further past that angle, we should be able to get something that's live for that. I think I should probably have deleted history, but because I think it might still be pulling some stuff in from this here, like this. So let me get back before we do this. I'm going to hit F8, delete history, Alt-Shift-D, or we can go to Edit and delete by type history, like that. And let's do this one again and apply it, just to make sure we just have just this history that's on here, like this. And I'm not sure with the live if it's going to do that for us. I just wanted to see if it's going to change that. It looks like I'm going to have to rerun it and hit apply. But you can see that angle is now greater than 30 degrees, so it automatically picked up that we need to make a hard edge on here and here because this angle is greater than 30 degrees. But it softens all the angles that are less than that, so this is all flat, and so it makes soft edges for that and hard edges where we need it. So I'm going to hit undo and get back here like this. Let's just select all the edges again and do this, hit apply. And I'll delete history, Alt-Shift-D. And I know that was like kind of a big explanation to kind of get to this point that I want to make about this, that there's some automation for selecting the hard edges on here. So if we select F10, select our edges on here. So we're going to go up to select and then use constraints and open this up and take a look at this here. And then let's go for our next selection, and then let's say smoothing, and we'll select just our hard edges like that. Now with that option turned on, if we select through our model like this, you can see that it automatically only selected the hard edges that we did for us. So you saw me kind of struggle and move along the entire object to select this selection type that we did. But with the if we control our model and we have soft and hard edges, and we put hard edges only where we want hard edges to be, we can use the selection constraint and easily kind of just select through our model like this and select that pretty easily. So that sets up kind of a workflow for you to easily select your hard edges. Okay, so once I've got that done, I want to release these selection constraints that I've got. So I'll put it on selection constraint nothing, and I'll close out and say close and remember, just so next time it doesn't keep making it to where I can only select just hard edges. So now, remember, if we do our bevel, we can shift right click and say bevel edge and do our option box for that, or just run it. That's one way that we can do it, or we can hit Control B and set this up. So I know that was kind of a long explanation, but again, I just wanted to show you this workflow. If you kind of get into this thing and you start to bevel your edges and you want to do this selection type, you could use that as a way of kind of speeding up your workflow a little bit. So I'll put this on 4 like this here. Okay, and I'll go ahead and leave this one here, and you can see we've got a pretty nice look. We don't have to hit smooth mesh preview. The model's kind of frozen exactly where it's at, especially if we delete history, Alt Shift D. So that's going to give us this model, and it's going to keep it at like a fixed polygon count for us. Okay, so the next thing that we can talk about is fencing. And one thing that we could do with this object, as I've selected this thing, let's just go ahead and make a new cube, and let's move it up here just like this. And you can see with fencing, it's basically this. We're going to use the tab 3 for the smooth mesh preview version of this, but I want to hold these edges. And in order for fencing to work, I want to hold all these edges, and for an edge to be held, you need a supporting edge on one side here and one side here for that, in order for that to hold. So I'm going to use the multi-cut tool. We're going to go into the modeling toolkit. The hotkey for turning this multi-cut tool on is Control-Shift-X, and that will turn it on. So we've got that. So if I hold down Control, we can basically insert an edge loop. So that's a really nice thing with this tool. You could click on an edge and then drag out from here if you wanted to do that. And while I drag out on this, you can see it's got numbers on here. If I hold down Shift, I can snap to these different increments within here like that. So this is if you want to not do something that's like, going all the way around the model. If I hold down Shift, again, I can snap to 50% of this, and then I can click and then drag out on this edge and then snap back to that original point right here like that, and then hit Enter. And so I made a really bad cut there just to show you how kind of that tool works. But if you hold down Control, you can just do an edge loop across the entire geometry, as long as your geometry is kind of sound on there. So let's tap 3 for this, and you can see what it's doing to hold that. I'll tap 1 to come back. Now I'm going to hold right here like this. So let's tap 3, and you can see how I'm holding this edge and through here. So we've almost got everything we need to kind of hold this edge. If I hold down Control and then click here and then here and tap 3, you can see I'm holding this corner just like that. Okay. So again, what I was saying, if we want to hold this edge, we need a supporting edge to hold here, and then now I've got a supporting holding edge here, and then here for this one. So this is going to hold, this is going to hold, but we don't have all of our supporting edges on here, and we definitely don't have it here. So watch what happens here. This is going to round out here like this. You can see what's kind of happening with this geometry. So maybe you can kind of start to see what's going on with this. Now, if I want to hold this entire thing as a cube, I need to get holding edges here, like this, a holding edge here. And as we move around, it looks like we've got everything that we need. Now we tap 3, and we've held this entire object that we see here like this. Okay? Okay, so that's going to be pretty easy for a cube. This example is going to be a bit more difficult to do, especially with the multi-cut tool. So we've got some problems with our geometry here. Like if we hold down Control, we can start to hold this edge. We can start to hold here. If we hold down Control, we're going to do this. And I'm going to try to work my way around the object this way. So we've got this. I'm holding here like this. Okay, and I think we're getting really close here. And it becomes, again, because this is a cube, like mainly like kind of cube shapes, it's not super difficult to do this. So I think we're almost there for having everything we need to hold this. I'll hold down Control and hold this edge here. So I'll tap 3, and I did miss something, so you can see it's going to become really obvious when we didn't hit a particular area like this. And now I got to have to hold this. So let's tap 3. And now we've held all the supporting edges that we need for this. Now what you could take a look at here and kind of go and say is, this thing is a little bit messy. Like, we don't really need to continue all this geometry out. Like, this is a flat surface, so we've kind of continued all this geometry by adding, you can see these edge loops all the way through the model like that. And if we have a flat surface, we really don't need any kind of geometry to kind of hold some of that stuff. So what can we do about that? It's mainly coming here in this section through here, and I added one too many on this side. So let's hit F10. I'm going to double click this, and if we have an edge loop that's selected like this, we could hit backspace to remove it. Now if we hit F9 and show our verts, we have these leftover verts that we got to select and then delete. So there is a way that we can select all this. I'll right click and say vert, or not vert, we'll say edge. And we can double click this. We can hold down Control when we hit backspace, and it'll delete the edge and all the verts all in one go. So that's kind of cool. And this is what I wanted to get to on here, is getting this geometry and getting it cleaned up a little bit. So we could double click on this, and I want to move this a little bit closer so we could move the geometry. That's one way that we could do it. If we shift right click on here, there is a slide edge tool, so we could select that, and then we could middle mouse drag, and we could kind of push this back. So I could do that with these as well if I want to kind of get these a little bit closer to the same distance on here, because I want to show you this. If we push this down, and if we tap 3, you can see the rounding on this is going to change if this is a little bit lower, right? If we want a nice consistent rounding across everything, we need to get everything kind of really close to the same distance on here. Now we're just kind of eyeballing this. There are some ways to try to get this to be numerically accurate for that, but we're just kind of eyeballing it right now. So we've got the rounding on here, but what could we potentially do to get rid of this geometry on here like this? What we could do is go to our vertices, select this, and I'm going to shift right click. And if you remember our merge vertices, there's another tool in here that's called target weld. And if we take this and take this vertice and push and pull it over to top of this one, it'll merge it together like this. So I'm merging this together here like that. And what I've done is taken this geometry, you can see it over here. So let's take a look at the difference here. We've been able to still kind of hold these edges here, but we've ended the topology right here like this. So what that'll allow us to do is right click and go to our edge, select this, hit backspace like that. And let's take a look real quick and tap 3, and you can see it still holds the edge, and it builds a quad here, quad here. Now we don't have quads going all the way around here because I've got to do something with the geometry. I'll just show you what's going to happen here. If we double click this to get rid of it, it goes all the way. This loop goes all the way across here like this to this. And if we hit that Control backspace like we talked about, it's going to get rid of the geometry, but I could start to cause some issues for myself. So let's get rid of this here, and I'll show you how we could clean this up. It's going to go to here. So we're going to have to start to deal with some of this stuff in each one of these corners. So I'll hit Control backspace on that one. I'm going to want to do the same thing over here. So maybe what would have been better is at the very beginning, before I started to delete this stuff out, is to do the same thing in these different areas where I can select this vert, shift right click, say merge vertices, do the target weld, and I can weld this up, and I can weld this up. So I've got this corner handled within through here, and now I need to do the same thing for this. Now I got to do the same thing for this and through here. Right here like that. Let's go ahead and push this over and push this over like that. And that's getting us to a place where we can right click, say our edge, and have tap Q to go out of that target weld tool. Anytime you need to end a tool, you can always use the pick thing, or you can tap Q and that will get you out of whatever tool that is. Sometimes it causes problems whenever you're doing UVs or some of these tools and it becomes confusing. So always try to remember that, tap Q to get out of there. So now I can double click this and it's going to go all the way around the model, you can see, and now I can hit Control Backspace to get rid of that. I can get rid of this one, and it should go all the way up to here to the top because it's moving all the way around the object. Control Backspace. Do the same thing for this one. Should go all the way here. Control Backspace. And I'm going to get rid of this as it goes all the way around the model here. Control Backspace. And then now we're starting to get something that's a bit cleaner for our model. So let's tap 3 and see what we've got here. And it's looking a bit more clean. Now if we wanted to get really fancy, we could try to end some topology as it goes all the way around the model here, but I think it might be a little bit overkill for things. So we can just kind of leave it where it's at. So let's tap 3 for this and say that looks pretty good and through there. Looks like I missed something, an edge here. So I'll do the modeling toolkit and let's go back to the multi-cut tool, and it looks like I missed one edge there, and we'll tap 3 for this and take a look at it. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So I wanted to show you this as well. Let's go out of this tool, and I need this object. Let's duplicate it, move it back like this. Let's tap 3 for this one just to leave that on. And we'll move this over here. And if you remember our selection type for this, let's hit F10 and select this. And we're selecting all of our edges, and let's go to select and then use constraints. We'll do next selection, and it should remember this hard selection. So we've just selected this here. Okay. And we're going to hit Control B to bevel, or we can shift right click and say bevel edge. And then we've got our options within here. So what I wanted to show you with this is if we do the segments and we do 2 like this, this is getting us really close to where we needed to be before, like what we're doing. So it's not going to be perfect, but I want to show you this. If we take this chamfer and turn it off, this chamfer allows the rounding to happen. Now if we don't put rounding on, we can kind of do an automated thing with our topology to where we basically took all of our edges and added this supporting edge like this. Now if we tap 3, you can see what we got going on here. We've got something that is very close. I'm going to turn on wireframe on shaded to this here. Now we don't have some of the geometry finished out all the way on this, so let's tap 1, and we could do something like this. I want to show you this. We're going to use the let's put this back on nothing and close and remember, just so we can select all of our edges normal. Let's put on the multi-cut tool. Now we can hold down Control, and we're going to just click from here, and I'm going to click and drag from here across the model like this. This is a way that we can turn this into quads and then end this topology. So I can click and drag out from here and come here. So this becomes something, if you keep this in mind in the future, this can be a pattern for you to kind of hold edges and then terminate the geometry, or end it in a way to where we can get quads moving on here. So we need something very similar in this area, so we can push here, and I'll click and drag across like that to end the geometry. And then now we can come from here, here, and I'm clicking on that edge and dragging to that point to make sure it snaps, clicking on this edge and snapping here to the edge by dragging all the way. So I'm going to click here, drag here, and let's tap 3 for this. And I just wanted to show you it's possible for us to get a fairly similar result than what we did here by kind of manually kind of coming through here. Now if you've got to kind of solve for a complex model and hold edges, this is what you're going to have to do to kind of figure this thing out. But if we've got something that's a little bit more regular like what we've got, you might be able to do maybe a little bit of a shortcut for some of this stuff to kind of do these holding edges. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to take a look at is this creasing. So we'll make another cube and we'll take this and just push this up and through here so we can kind of take a look at it. And again, if we tap 3, we got our smooth mesh preview version here. If we hit F10 to select our edges, or we right click on here and say edges, let's select all the edges. And then we can shift right click and there's a crease tool on here. And what this allows you to do is any edge that you have selected, you can select one edge at a time. And if you middle mouse drag, it's going to turn that creasing on. So it's not going to really be apparent what's going on until you tap 3 for the smooth mesh preview version of this. But you can see if I select this next edge and I middle mouse drag to the right, we're able to crease this. I'm going to crease this here and here, just like that. And we're starting to get creasing on these different edges. If I crease this and I crease this, that's a possibility. We can also select vertices, and I'm going to right click and say vert. And we can do that, and we can right click and we can crease vertices. So it's kind of interesting what's happening on here, and you see we can see these controls for this to see the creasing amount. Remember, we can also hit page up to up our level of fidelity in this. So this again, with very little geometry and with creasing, you can get a really crisp looking model, and you've got very little geometry that you've got to kind of work with to get these shapes going. Okay, so this could look like some kind of futuristic weird mailbox or something like that. I'm going to hit undo to get rid of those creases. Now you can also, if something's creased, you can put it on the creasing tool, and again you can always shift right click to get to it, the crease tool, and middle mouse drag to all the way to the left, and that will get rid of creasing altogether. Okay, now you can get, depending on where you slide on this, you can get to these various creasing levels. Now if we hit Control A to bring up this this level on here, you can see that there is some levels on here. So if you wanted a specific value, like so let's say 5, we could do that. If we put it at 2 or 1, you can type numerically what those values are that you want it to be, and you can see how when we middle mouse drag how that's changing. I'm going to put this back down to 0, so I'm going to select all the edges. So that's a kind of a cool shape there, like that. I'll select through all the edges and then crease the entire object. Now if you saw what was going on there, if I hold down Control whenever we middle mouse drag, we can get lower levels of increments of creasing on here like this. I'm trying to see if there was more creasing for just the polygon. Okay, so there's edges and there's going to be verts. So it's going to hold it within here. So if we wanted a very specific value like 2, we can do that. So you can see that we're kind of rounding out this cube a little bit by doing this. The reason I don't really like this method is because if we do page down like this, the shading on it just doesn't look all that great. And you usually have to take this, if you remember, we had to go to modify and convert and do convert smooth mesh preview to polygons, and then at that point you actually have real geometry that you can start to control with the smooth edges and hardened edges that we looked at. So yeah, it's just maybe additional steps. Now what I do like to do is maybe work with this, and then we're going to take a look at how we can model in stages. Okay, so with this I'm going to hit F10. I'm going to select all the edges through here, and because we have this thing as a cube, we could shift right click, say crease tool, tap 3. Now that's going to hold hard edges for everything. This is what I was talking about, where I just do not like the way that it shades through this model. It can help if you hit page up for this, but it still doesn't look all that great. Let's turn off wireframe on shaded. So it has this kind of look. Again, not a big fan of how it shades the model. Now I did select all the edges within through here. Let's get rid of the creasing. Shift right click, say crease tool, get rid of all the creasing on here like this. And again, we can select through this, and if we go to our selection constraints, let's use a constraint, let's do next selection, and select just the hard edges on here, and then we can crease just this within here like that. Okay, I'm going to put this on nothing, close and remember, like that. And this is what I was telling you where if we hit F8 for our object, let's go to modify, convert, smooth mesh preview to polygons, and lots of polygons, right? So we can go to here, divisions, let's put this down to 2, something like that. It doesn't shade very well. I'm going to hit F10, select our edges at that point, and we could select through the entire model and shift right click, and I'll do soften harden. Let's do that soften and harden with the options. Remember this angle, and hit apply, and we get back to something that looked like our original model. Now what's kind of interesting is if we tap 3 for smooth mesh preview on there, we can take a look. It still retains the creases on here, so that's something to kind of note. Even though we had creasing information, we converted it over from smooth mesh preview to polygons. We've got real polygons now. It still holds the creasing information, which that could be something that you want. But if I select all these edges and I shift right click and get rid of my crease tool, I can middle mouse drag to the left and it gets rid of all the creasing. Now we've got something that looks kind of soft and doughy. It doesn't look quite as good as this here, and it doesn't look quite as good as this here, but that's just because we've got this thing going on here where you can see we don't have holding edges that are really close to here. If you wanted to manipulate this topology, you could. We can double click this edge loop. Remember, we can shift right click, and we looked at the slide edge tool. So we could slide this up. We can double click this one, slide this one over, and then we could do the same thing for this geometry here. You can see it's kind of wobbly, so this is where we could scale this and kind of get this nice and flat. We could do the same thing for this here and hit W, hold down V, and then snap here. But then this starts to be a lot of work to kind of get to where we're at here. So I just wanted to show you that it's possible for us to get our model and get it in this state where we're starting to work with this geometry. We've got this extra geometry, and then we can kind of start working in stages. So that is going to be the next thing that we're going to kind of concentrate in. So I'm kind of bleeding into the next area, just like I was doing with the last thing, but I just want to show you that that's possible. So we'll do a deeper dive into that and take a look at that and show you that it's possible to work in this way. So again, I wanted to show you that there's these different methods and different ways of working with our geometry to get similar results. Each one has a little bit of a difference. I'll just tell you this: if you want to model for like the movie industry, this is the method. The fencing method is the method that they use for this. And ultimately, even if you use some beveling or use some creasing, and then you finally end up getting to this method of using fencing, if you're going to model super, super clean, like I was saying, for something like the film world, your model at the very end has to have this fencing information, and it has to be able to, if you tap 3, you have to do this smooth mesh preview, and you should have only 2 divisions on your model to get to what your final model is going to be whenever it renders, okay? So that's a lot of information to kind of take into, but again, if you wanted a deeper dive, go take a look at JL Mussi and take a look at his page. I highly recommend his videos, and he's got tons and tons of videos on just modeling in general. Because this video that I'm producing for you right now, it's going to have a lot of information in there, but it's going to go very quick and try to give you just a big overview of all the different ways that you can approach modeling for things. Okay, after everything that we've looked at to this point, I think that you should have a pretty good idea about how topology is starting to work. This video is starting to get pretty long. It's over an hour right now, and what I believe is that there's still a lot more to discuss about topology, but I think it's starting to get maybe just a little bit more advanced topics. So this next section is going to cover different topics about how we can do some paneling, how we can work in various stages using some of the techniques that we just looked at, where we use bevel, fencing, or creasing in the smooth mesh preview to polygon, that workflow, and then kind of pushing that forward to get even more details on there. We'll also take a look at NURB surfaces, how to use those. We'll take a look at using wrap deformers, so deformer types, as something that can help you out with modeling, and maybe take a look at a bend deformer. I think that's a pretty important thing to take a look at. And we'll take a little bit of a look at resurfacing tools and using that as a means of generating topology as well. So be on the lookout for that next video. It's going to have a lot of material in there. See you in the next video.